In October of 1997, a 15-year-old boy named John Hartman was beaten to death on the streets of Fairbanks, Alaska. 4 young men, 3 of them Athabascan Indians, were convicted of his murder. Yet years later, the case remains open and unsolved. Who's responsible? How many killers were out on the streets that night? Was racism to blame for these convictions? I'm your host, Matt Ralston, and this is the story of John Hartman and the Fairbanks 4, case of murder on ice. Welcome to our second bonus episode of Murder on Ice. We'll be updating the Fairbanks 4 case, their lawsuit, what's going on with convicted murderers William Holmes and Jason Wallace very soon. In the meantime, we're going to talk with Megan Edge, who's the spokesperson for the American Civil Liberties Union of Alaska, and she'll be talking about prisons in Alaska. Then we'll talk with lawyer Tyler Broker about some of the legal implications regarding the Fairbanks 4 case. Please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It takes about a minute. Really helps out. Please tell a friend. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder on Ice. Here's Megan Edge. I guess I'll start. I'm not sure where we kind of left off last time we spoke, but I was curious about the prison conditions in Alaska, kind of why don't you introduce yourself before we start?
Sure. So my name is Megan Edge, and I'm the communications director for the ACLU of Alaska. But this case is actually kind of interesting to me because prior to this case, I worked for the Department of Corrections, and prior to that, I was a journalist, and the Fairbanks 4 came up quite often.
What did you do for the Department of Corrections?
I was their public information officer, but I worked on several projects with incarcerated people to help implement several prison reform measures.
So you're familiar with the Fairbanks 4 thing?
Yes.
And
they seem to come up in every job I have had.
So how do you think prisons are in Alaska compared to maybe other parts of the United States? I know there's no scientific way to measure it, but just based on your experience.
Yeah, I mean, comparing prisons is like comparing apples to oranges. There's a lot of different factors that make, Alaska's prisons unique from prisons in the lower 48. And as far as conditions go, I don't have much to compare them to except what I've seen here and what I know about other places. So I don't really know where to start, but I'll start on the facility in Fairbanks, where this all started for the Fairbanks 4.
That's the Fairbanks Correctional Facility.
Yeah, the Fairbanks Correctional Facility is designed to be a pretrial facility. So, in theory, the people who live there are really only going to be there for as long as they're going through their court process and before their trial and really through their sentencing. And so there's not a lot of programming. Typically, pretrial facilities don't have a lot of programming. Which is something that should probably be changed. But also Fairbanks is a very overcrowded facility. I look at daily count sheets for all of Alaska's prisons, and Fairbanks is almost always overcrowded. So what that means is that there are multiple people sleeping in, their gymnasiums on bunks and in what they call boats, which are essentially like a cot that's on the floor. It's pretty out of date. It needs probably some renovation to bring it up to speed, bring it up to standard, I would think. It's like any facility. Pretrial facilities are typically more volatile than a sentence facility. People are very vulnerable in that space. They don't know what's going to happen to their future. Mental health, substance misuse issues have yet to be addressed. And it's a revolving door. You have people who could spend years in a pretrial facility waiting for their day in court or to be sentenced. Or you could have somebody who violated probation by being late to an appointment or failing a drug test, and they can go back in for a few days and a couple of weeks. So it's really a revolving door. Pretrial facilities are often also holding places for people who are intoxicated or people in the throes of a mental health crisis. So that's sort of the gist of where they're at. But big picture, Alaska prisons compared to the rest of the country, in many ways, our jails and prisons are behind the times as far as what they offer in programming, how they offer visitation. So, for example, during COVID-19, people who are incarcerated in Alaska have had no face-to-face family contact, no face-to-face contact with their elders or their community, because for COVID-19, the Department of Corrections suspended visitation. And other places, what we're seeing is the use of technology, programs like Skype or Zoom or even Microsoft Teams, to still get that face-to-face family connection. And that's really important in a person's rehabilitation. You need to establish healthy relationships. If healthy relationships are taken away from you and you are released, the likelihood of your success is much, much less, because the only relationship that you have had was probably with the people who helped you get to prison in the first place. So those family dynamics and that cultural connection is really, really important. So technology-wise, I would say Alaska is very far behind the times, and also with their work programs, just really out of date. And the downside to all of that, one thing I hear a lot when I talk about this is that, that's easy on criminals, when you improve conditions of confinement. And I can't agree with that argument. Because if you put somebody in a jail cell and you treat them like an animal, how do you expect them to act when they're released? It's in the interest of public safety to actually make efforts to rehabilitate the people who are incarcerated. And one other thing that I think is really important to mention is that Alaska disproportionately incarcerates Alaska Native people. So they make up about 33-ish% of the prison population, but only 15% of Alaska's total population. And that's not a reflection of dangerousness. I think that's more a reflection of systemic racism.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a friend that spent the night in the Fairbanks Correctional Facility, and he said that the pillow was so uncomfortable that he chose to use the phone book as the pillow, which I don't know if that anecdote does any justice whatsoever to the conditions, but I've heard it's really rough. There's fighting going on all the time among guys with different beef and whatnot. The argument that better conditions would encourage prisoners seems kind of completely ridiculous. A guy's debating committing a crime, and he's like, "Oh, I heard they have a TV room now." What does that even mean?
Yeah, no, it's. I think it's a ridiculous argument too. But I think that collectively as a society, we have to really rethink and do 180-degree shift about how we look at prisons, the people who are incarcerated, and even the people who are interacting with the criminal legal system. That's an old way of thinking that it'll be lost on them. But there's a lot of things that happen to people who are incarcerated that are truly dehumanizing. One thing I think of is, for example, this winter around the holidays. And so the holidays are a very emotional time for a lot of people who are serving time, not just like in a pretrial facility, but especially for people who are serving their sentences. The holidays are just an awful time to go through. It's emotional, it's sad, you want to be with your family, you want to be with your kids. And there's none of that. There's no, and this year there was no face-to-face visitation. And the Department of Corrections, changed their mail policy in the middle of all of this about how incarcerated people can receive pictures. And they made this process incredibly cumbersome on the families and the loved ones of those who are incarcerated. And it's those little things that take any ounce of humanity that a person has when they're living in that hell, and they just take it away for no reason, and for no good argument because they can. And, and it's the mental game of it all is, I think, what really gets to people. And it's not constructive. You can't, society often treats people who are incarcerated as less than human. And that is just one of many ways that they do it. It's just to isolate them. Or, it'll be a week or something before somebody gets their mail, or it could take 2 weeks to get it, or it can never get here. They can reject mail for a variety of reasons. And I don't mean to stick to mail, but it's just one very basic human way of how we communicate and stay connected that they just revoked during the holidays and during the pandemic. It was just really disheartening for a lot of people. And you talk about the comfort of pillows. I mean, they've also changed, and recently they've also changed the policy on how and when incarcerated people can get new shoes, for example. So, for example, for an incarcerated person to get a pair of actual shoes, they can do it during their birthday month. Well, if your birthday is in January and you rip a hole in your sneakers sometime between then and your next birthday, you're supposed to walk around with holes in your shoes till your next birthday. It's just totally inhumane and arbitrary.
Yeah, it kind of rings of fascism. So what, with the Fairbanks 4, and I didn't know this before I started covering the story, and I don't think most people would assume this, that the state of Alaska, for example, and other states do it too, they contract with other states to house their prisoners. And the Fairbanks, I think 3, if not all of them, at some point spent time at facilities in Arizona and Colorado. And these are private prisons with bad reputations. And, even if you were, say you were in Texas and you were housed in Oklahoma or whatever, that would still be odd and prohibitive, I would think. But, it's so far away that you're cutting these people off from their entire families. Is that going to, can you speak to how that process came about, why that was deemed a policy?
Sure. So Alaska is grappling with the same issue today. We are in the midst of a mass incarceration crisis. And that means a lot of things, but one of them is that there's not enough bed space at the jails and prisons the state has to house all of these people. And there is, some litigation done about overcrowding as well that I can share with you in an email if that's helpful. But Alaska's prisons are overcrowded today, and they were overcrowded in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And in this old school way of thinking about how we think about prisons, the answers to that is often more prisons, more beds. Building prisons is not cheap. When the Spring Creek Correctional Facility was built in Seward, the whole town of Seward was mostly quite upset. They didn't want a prison in their front yard. So there's a lot of issues with building new prisons. They're expensive, whatever. And so then the other option that, these people in positions of power often go to is to find contracts with private prisons. And we don't have private prisons in Alaska. So those would be in the lower 48, which is what happened to the Fairbanks Four and a lot of other people. It was their solution to the mass incarceration crisis. But that's not a solution at all. Like, more prisons, more beds is never the answer. In fact, last winter, the Department of Corrections wanted to send more prisoners back out of state again to solve their mass incarceration crisis. And luckily it got shut down fairly quickly. But then they transitioned to, they're going to spend money. And mind you, we're in the middle of a fiscal crisis. But they decided that they would spend some money and allocate their limited dollars to reopening the Palmer Correctional Center, which has been shut down for a few years. And again, more beds, not the answer. What officials should be doing, what is smart justice and what smart public safety, is using that money that you would spend on a private prison contract or to reopen a prison, to spend that money instead on rehabilitation that keeps people out of prison. Alaska has a recidivism rate of more than 60%. And recidivism in Alaska is defined as any return to custody within the first 3 years of release from incarceration. And that could be anything from a probation or a parole violation to a new crime, any of it. So 60-something%, I think it's about 63 the last time I checked, is a really high recidivism rate number. So if you actually offered strong programming that rehabilitated people, that addressed mental health and substance misuse, you can make a lot of traction in lowering that number, which would in turn make our communities a lot safer. Alaska has basically no resources for anybody who's dealing with a mental health crisis or a substance misuse issue. So 86% of the prison population has been diagnosed with one or both of those issues. So how much smarter would it be to actually spend that money on the front end of things? But going back to your question related to the Fairbanks Four, because I kind of went on a rabbit hole there. But what happened was the same thing. Our prisons were overcrowded, so they did what a lot of other states still do and signed these private prison contracts in the lower 48. And that did a few really bad things, but one of them was the disconnect to family and culture and rehabilitation. They were so far from home, there was no way that they could actually see their kids or see their significant other or their parents. And it's what we're seeing today, even during COVID. And it's just detrimental to somebody's mental health and to their success in their rehabilitation. But eventually, Alaska got a little bit smarter and decided to end those contracts. But it wasn't like they did it willingly. There was a lot of public outcry to return these incarcerated people back to Alaska. And so Alaska built the Goose Creek Correctional Center at Point McKenzie and started filling those beds and eventually shut down Palmer. I don't know where you need to go back into the details, but that's kind of the gist of what happened.
Right. Yeah, I know Alaskans aren't a fan of paying taxes, but I guess there's really no magic solution. If you want to continue mass incarcerating people, you have to house them. So I'm not sure how well that's been thought through, but
there just seems to be this adverse reaction every time there is a concerted effort to change the way we handle prisons. The amount of public outcry is just, it's alarming. And I think a lot of it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that we have to shift the way that we talk about prisons, the people who are incarcerated, anybody labeled criminal, and really anybody who's interacting with the criminal legal system. You're going to spend money, whether that's on prison beds or on front-end treatment for mental health and substance misuse. You're going to have to spend money. So how would you rather spend that money? Like, do you want to keep people from going to jail, or do you want to pay $125 a day for them to live the rest of their life in a jail cell? I think it's really more about how you want to spend your money. But really, to be honest with you, bringing this conversation back to money for me makes me even a little bit nervous. And not, I guess maybe nervous isn't the right word, but I have some hesitancy there. And I think it's because when I look at history and the evolution of the American prison system, it always stems back to, it always puts a price tag on a human being. When, if, I don't know how much you know about, the history of our prisons, but the modern day prison system, it was developed after the abolishment of slavery. These economies that relied on free labor were suddenly crashing. And so then there became a financial incentive to keep people in cages. And not only that, but it sort of shifted the way that we think about people who are incarcerated. Like, they just deserve to live in this punitive hell until they die.
And to work for free to support the state. I don't know if that happens in Alaska, but as far as the history goes, that was a big reason, right? As well as to get minorities off the streets.
Exactly. So,
is there, because you said they opened the Goose Creek facility, so is there any possibility, I guess anything's possible, but for them to contract with other states again? Like in the future?
So like I mentioned, last winter, they really pushed to try and fill. They opened the bid for a private prison contract last winter. And then the Alaska legislature, I think, pushed by advocates, shut that down really quickly. And then they transitioned to this idea of reopening the Palmer Correctional Center. And that was actually supposed to open in 2020, but it never got completed.
I see.
So I think in a lot of ways, the possibility of sending Alaska's prisoners to private prisons in the lower 48 is always a possibility. It depends on the administration, largely. The current governor's administration, the first thing that they did was undo a package of criminal justice reforms that had been implemented under the prior administration. So almost instantly, we saw a rise in Alaska's prison population. And so as long as we continue to refuse to find actual solutions to the mass incarceration crisis, I think finding contracts for private prisons in the lower 48 are probably always on the table.
So given the overcrowding, everyone knows that in prison there are white supremacist prison gangs. There's a guy named Filthy Fjord, that's his legal name. He changed it in Anchorage from something dorky. And he, there's a big white supremacist gang there, Aryan Brotherhood. There's, I'm sure, a black manifestation of that. But given there's a disproportionate Native population and that there's overcrowding, I'm sure would contribute. Has that led to, I've heard there's a Native Brotherhood prison gang, but I don't know about it.
Yeah, there is. There's the Native Brotherhood. And so in Alaska's prisons, I would say that the 1488, the white supremacist, is one of the most prominent gangs. And then there's the Native Brotherhood, which have been involved in riots. All gangs in prisons have the potential to be involved in criminal activity while they're incarcerated, So I don't know if there's one that's more, but yeah, the Native Brotherhood is a current gang in our prisons. And, the story of how it got here is kind of interesting.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So when Alaska chose to send its incarcerated people to private prisons in the lower 48, they were sending our incarcerated people into these schools of real criminality. And one thing, and this is the story that has been passed down to me. It was one I heard when I was a journalist, and one when I worked for DOC. But essentially, like the birth of the Native Brotherhood. So Alaska chose to send its incarcerated people to these private prisons in the lower 48, which were much rougher than the prisons that we have here. And by rougher, I mean more violent and a lot more gangs. So there were gangs for white offenders, there were gangs for Black offenders, but our Alaska Native population didn't really have a place. And it's not to excuse it, but there's a lot of reasons why people, not only in prison, but in the communities in this country and around the world, join gangs. And it's a way to survive often. So for these incarcerated people, they had no protection and they were vulnerable to violence. And so they formed the Alaska Native Brotherhood. So they had strength, so they could survive. So they had family and connection. And I realize when I'm saying that, and it makes it sound like an excuse, but I think it's really important to understand like why people do the things that they do. And that's what they were looking for. So when Alaska brought its incarcerated people back, they also brought that culture of gang violence back. And in the discussions last winter about possibly sending incarcerated people to private prisons in the lower 48, the birth of the Native Brotherhood was heavily discussed. And I don't know if there's a way to say 100% this is exactly how it happened, but that's the story as I know it. I mean, I think it's a good lesson in incarceration in general and why prisons aren't the best place for everybody. There are people who go to prison, and there's a lot of people who go to prison and they do their best. They do as much programming as they can. They want to be successful when they're released. And then there's a lot of people who maybe weren't as serious of a criminal. Maybe they went in for a drug possession or even a theft. And now they're living in close quarters with people who are only criminals. And for better or for worse, they pick up that same behavior.
So they were eventually released from prison. They haven't been exonerated, but they've had their convictions vacated. That's a whole story that I've figured out. It was confusing at first because I had to get out a thesaurus and talk to a bunch of lawyers, but they were released and they were given a release dismissal agreement. And what that means is that there's conditions to your release, such as you cannot sue for being wrongly incarcerated or for any number of things. Is that something that the ACLU, I'm sure it's aware of, but is that something that you've been involved with?
Yeah, it's something that we've been involved with. Qualified immunity is what that is. It essentially offers protection to the powerful people in our communities who acted inappropriately, failed to do their jobs, and, ultimately for the Fairbanks 4 led to their wrongful conviction. It is a shield to protect them from consequence. And that's an issue that we see here in Alaska, and it's an issue that we see across the country. This happens all the time. The Fairbanks 4 were coerced into choosing their freedom or the financial reparations for the years that they spent in prison. I mean, collectively, the Fairbanks 4 spent more than 70 years in prison. They went to jail in 1997. They lost their youth. They lost so much of their future, and they deserve reparations. So the issue of qualified immunity is something that it's on our radar. It's something that is a point of discussion nationally. The bottom line is that it shouldn't matter if you're a police officer or a prosecutor. In the case of the Fairbanks Four, these 4 young boys lost their youth and so much of their life because the Fairbanks Police Department and prosecutors didn't do their jobs. You can't ask these men now to choose if they want to be free or get what's owed to them. They can't give back the years of their life that were wasted.
Yeah, and I know Alaska doesn't have any laws about compensation, right?
No. Yeah.
So what about if a prosecutor were to have acted negligently or maybe nefariously, and perhaps committed perjury? I know that I would go to jail at the very least for that. Is there any movement to hold these people accountable, not just say, all right, we all decided that you're not a good person, but given that you aggressively prosecute other people, maybe you need to be held to that same standard?
We have conversations internally about what to do with it, and I can't share the specifics of it, but it's on our radar. Whether you're a prosecutor or a police officer, it's unacceptable. And in general, I want to be clear that no matter who you are, the ACLU's stance is never longer prison sentences or more jail time for anybody. We want to fix bad laws that disproportionately impact powerless people.
Oh, see, I'm kind of a spiteful person, so I guess you've removed that from the equation, which is probably good.
No, I just think it's a good point to clarify that no matter who you are, that's not the solution either. We need better laws that prohibit things like this from happening, and there has to be accountability. These bad actors are the reason why 4 young men lost years off their life. There should be accountability on behalf of the city of Fairbanks. There has to be accountability. There's no justice without accountability.
Do you think that in sort of a nuanced issue or just a minor piece of this puzzle, but when Eugene Vent, for sure, and Marvin Roberts and George Freese were interviewed by detectives and deputies at the Fairbanks Police Department, a tactic they would use was to give them false information, which the interrogee may believe to be true because they don't know, but that was a tactic that they would feed them false information, and I think most people probably don't know that that's legal. So if a police officer says to me, your friend ratted you out, he's allowed to make that up. Is that something that you think should stand? I mean, I'm sure it can catch guilty people, or do you think it's problematic?
I think it's problematic, but really, that this is what makes criminal legal system reform, I think, very complicated. And I think a lot of people are hesitant to dive in. And when they do dive in, they realize that you can't just address one issue. You have to hit all of the actors in the legal system. So that means you have to address police, you have to address prisons, you have to address prosecutors, you have to address sentencing, you have to address mental health and substance misuse. They're all interconnected. And the American justice system is not flawless. And I think that's glaringly apparent to most people. But to solve these issues, you really have to tackle them holistically. And you have to, you start unwinding one problem, and you find 4 more that also has to be addressed. And so I think change to the criminal legal system comes, in incremental doses, but there has to be a clear and general understanding, the 30,000-foot view, that you have to fix all of the little broken pieces.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone recently who was very opinionated, and my stance was that everyone in the system, from prosecutors to attorneys to the people themselves, criminals, probation officers, judges, especially, whatever it is, that, remove them and just look at the big picture, which is that I think anyone would agree that we have too many people incarcerated. The number is embarrassing. It's more than communist China, where they kill journalists. And so if you just step back and look at that, then everyone involved is complicit, in my opinion.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so I think where the challenge comes in is, where do you start? When we at the ACLU of Alaska look at the problems with the criminal legal system, that's often the question that comes up. We could take one issue and we can pull it apart and find 2,000 issues just within that. And then the decisions become, where do you start? And assessing it from there. There's 1,000 ways to approach it, and they're all necessary. And, and I think one that I was actually really thinking about this morning was, I think one important step as a communicator is changing the way that we talk about the criminal legal system, that we talk about the people who are involved in it, the people who are in prison. Because I think when you start changing the way that we as a society talk about it, you really start turning the wheels to change it. It puts pressure on policymakers. It means that we'll hold people accountable, and we're very clear about what we want. I was reading this morning this post from the Anchorage Police Department, and it's every Wednesday they post a What Not to Do Wednesday. And I was getting so heated reading this post because they're convicting, they're in this powerful position. A lot of people look at the police department like these are heroes, they keep us safe. But there's a lot of people who don't look at the police like that. And so in this post, they talked about this a physical fight that had been reported to them in a parking lot between a man and a woman. And they show up at the parking lot, and the man and the woman don't want anything to do with the police. They denied that it ever occurred. So, and so in the story, they refer to this couple as Mr. and Mrs. Lovebird, which, by the way, if this really is a domestic violence situation, which we don't know, but if it is, referring to her as Miss Lovebird is wildly unacceptable.
Miss Lovebird.
They also convict this person. They make light of the fact that they had to wrestle him to the ground. There was a dog pile on him. And then that he's got 5 criminal charges and is going to a pretrial facility during a pandemic. And just the way they hold this incredibly powerful and influential position that influences the way that the Anchorage community looks at people who are interacting with the system and police. And now they've humiliated them, these 2 people who they also protect and serve. They make a joke out of the fact that this person's going to jail during a pandemic. And they make light of the fact that they just took away this person's freedom. Essentially what they said happened was this couple denied that they had anything, that they were fighting. And then the gentleman tried to fight the police officers. That's what they said happened. And it's this really one-sided narrative that leaves a lot of other, that just the way that they talk about it just made me shake to my core, because that's totally inappropriate, And then yesterday they posted something convicting a man that they just arrested, who has not been to court, saying that he stole these 3 vehicles. Well, a court hasn't actually decided that this person is guilty. But now the whole Anchorage community has already convicted this gentleman in the court of public opinion. So, I think that we have to change the way that we talk about the system. And for this case of what happened today with the lovebirds, the consequences of that is now this gentleman is going to jail with 5 criminal charges. Can he afford bail, or is he going to sit in a cage until our already backlogged court system has time to hear his case? During COVID, that could take weeks or months. And in the meantime, this gentleman might lose his job, his housing. So there's all these collateral consequences of the way that they wrote about this interaction with these 2 people. What makes me really, passionate about that is, I think about that in the way that we talk about people who are charged with crimes. I look at the Fairbanks 4. The Fairbanks Police Department, out of the gate, said, yep, we found our killers, before they even went to trial, before there was any oversight of what was happening with those teenagers and these powerful police officers. They convicted them in the court public opinion before those kids ever had a chance in court.
Yeah, the hero angle, I mean, they're really the ones driving that rhetoric, which I get, because most people like to brag about themselves and pretend that they're more important than they are. I happen to know that in terms of the danger of their jobs, which they're pretty quick to tell you about, that driving a cab, you're more likely to get killed in the line of duty driving a cab, working at a convenience store, working at a retail store. And that's not to minimize the job that they're doing. I do know that if you're serving and protecting a community, I'm really curious as to why people aren't happy to see you when they're not committing a crime. That's what I would ask them, and maybe I will. But the first time I got a gun drawn in my face for drinking a beer, and it was a light beer, I kind of just took a different stance than you should have free reign to do whatever you want. But that's just me personally.
Yeah.
What do you see going forward for these guys? There's this civil case, and what they're suing for is to be exonerated so that they can be compensated. Do you have any thoughts on how that? I haven't followed it as closely as you have, probably.
I can't speculate on, what I think would happen. I mean, I know what I think should happen. They should be exonerated and they should receive compensation. But unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball to look and see what our justice system will do.
How would you propose compensation? What is a logical way of doing that?
And there's a lot of ways to look at it. I mean, you could look at lost wages and lost permanent fund dividends, or you could look, and you could look at the mental and physical trauma that was caused to them, through their wrongful conviction and prolonged incarceration. You can look at that. I mean, also look at their future. What does their future look like? I mean, I'm sure that the Fairbanks 4 are perfectly smart, competent people who are going to do great things in our society and in our communities. But there's the reality that living in prison, no matter how good you are, is a traumatic experience. I talk to incarcerated people daily, and I, not even that long ago, was talking to an incarcerated person who was telling me what it was like. He's seen 2 people kill themselves. He's seen fights, he's seen coercion, and, so there is a lot of trauma that comes from incarceration in itself. No matter how stable, no matter how good you are, no matter how strong you are, there is a lot of trauma that comes from that. So when I talk about compensation, I think there's a lot of different ways that you could estimate what that would look like. And what is the value of a person's life, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would look at it, I think, practicality wise, just all I would say is they should have more than an average life going forward because, you know, a lot of their life's been taken away if they've been exonerated. And obviously, I think that having money, like to buy brunches and stuff, I think it does make people happier. And that's not to be superficial or materialistic, because I don't think any of that stuff makes people happier. But I think having stability alleviates a lot of anxiety and alleviates the probability of going back to prison probably as well. So that's all I would say about it, is something stable so that they can focus on actually getting their lives together for the first time, really. But,
yeah, I mean, not, you know, to be stable, you know, they need to be stable, and they need to be able to access resources to be successful. And, you know, maybe that mental health resources addressing the trauma of incarceration, maybe that education, you know, that all costs money. And, you know, I think about that. Like, I wonder, you know, when I look at the Fairbanks 4, like, I wonder, like, would they have gone to college? Where would they be if they hadn't gone there? You know, and nobody knows who they're going to be when they're a teenager. But, you know, there's a lot of life and a lot of opportunity that was taken away from them. And they deserve to be compensated.
that was very informative. Here's Tyler Broker, lawyer. What have you read about it so far?
Well, I went through all of the Newsminer stuff, and I've been really kind of focusing today on the agreement with the, you know, in 2015 that vacated the convictions. And, you know, I mean, I think it's like strange because, you know, the attorney general at the time said that, like, it seems like almost like the right outcome was reached. Like, the attorney general says, like, hey, the agreement is, you know, these guys got to admit that they were tried, convicted, or whatever. So it's not a exoneration, right? But at the same time, the attorney general says, but we also, you know, it's you know, from our end, it's an acceptance or, you know, a statement that, hey, if they were retried today with the evidence we have, it doesn't look like they would be convicted.
Right.
It would be difficult, I think is what he said. It'd be very difficult to convict them. And so it's kind of like, and that's kind of how, I mean, it all, I guess that it was my preconceived notion and from everything I've read on it, but that's kind of how I see it. Like, I think the most damning evidence to me, and when I look back on it, it was George Freeze that was in the hospital the next day. And he told a nurse he, like, broke his foot, or he thought it was broken. And the nurse's note said, that his statement was, hey, I was drunk, got in a fight, don't really know what happened. And that to me is like one of the most damning pieces of evidence. But
yeah, and I agree. It's almost like, you know, these guys are the Fairbanks 4 as they've come to be known, and that's kind of a take on the West Memphis 3 and the Seattle 7. You know, that's been a rhetorical device for a long time, but I almost feel like you have to separate, well, all 4 of them because they're individuals, but it's almost like Kevin Peace and George Freeze don't seem to have a whole lot in common with their character as that of Marvin and Eugene. And when you talk to people who are convinced that all 4 of them are innocent, they do a lot of talking about Eugene and Marvin and not as much about Kevin and George, right?
yeah.
You know, it gives me pause too, because he's got a broken foot. You know, before the murder of John Hartman and before him being tried, he was convicted of pulling a gun on some tourists, and he said he didn't do that. Since being released, he was arrested for stealing a car and evading police. And so it does go back. So I think his official stance now. So first of all, just in that hospital, let's just focus on that morning in that hospital.
Yeah.
He's being interviewed by Detective Ring. And one of the first things he says in the tape-recorded interview is, so would it be manslaughter or, end of quote there. But is that on your mind if you didn't do anything? I mean, I don't know, but I'm just trying to think of, is that something an innocent person would say?
I guess I don't. I see your point, and I see what you're trying to, get at. I guess I've always disliked those kind of analogies because you don't really. I mean, yeah, if the cops are talking, I mean, it goes both ways, right? I could see how it's so subjective, and this is the problem. I could see how in some ways you might look at that and go, man, that's not really something an innocent person would say. But at the same time, you're drunk, you don't really remember much, and you think you got into a fight, and the cops are saying like, hey, you did this to this kid. Like, you immediately start thinking, oh my God, even you may not have done it, but I could see both ways on how that'd be a natural inclination to be like, oh man, how much shit am I really in? You know what I mean? Yeah. Whereas also it's like, well, okay, if you didn't do anything, then what's your deal? But I think like he's admitted, right? He's admitted that he thinks he got into a fight.
Yeah, I think his sort of stance now, kind of after the fact, was and these are comments well after the trial, his initial trial. But he's saying, I went back to my apartment and I kind of got in a wrestling match with my buddy. We were drinking and he kind of fell on my foot. And then I walked into the hospital and just as some macho, he's 19. I'm sorry, he's 20. He's 20 years old. So just to sound kind of macho, maybe he doesn't want to admit he's walking into the hospital because of a drunken wrestling match. So he told them I got in a fight just to kind of sound cool. I think we can all relate to kind of using rhetorical tactics like that, right?
I mean, that gets into the other subjective. I don't really know. I don't know how it makes you, look. I guess. I mean, either way. I mean, even as a 19-year-old, I think it looked kind of dumb either way. Whether you had an actual fight or you were messing around and injured your foot. By the way, you got injured. And so I don't really, whether you're saying it's in a fight and you were messing around, I don't know. I guess.
I don't know either. I mean, it kind of makes sense, but, then you got to wonder, like,
I guess I'm just going, I think, you look at the triage. I mean, I guess look at it from, because what I'm focused on putting on my lawyer hat is, what it looks like to a jury and what you can put into a court of law, what's evidence. And here you have a triage assessment of George when he's at the hospital, and he's there specifically for foot pain. I'm reading the quote here, and the triage assessment is: got in a fight last night, doesn't know how it happened, he was drunk, has a bruise. And man, that doesn't look good. I mean, of course, it could be anything, foot, anything, I guess, and you could throw in all those factors. But as far as evidence goes, that's that I think is the most substantial evidence, they had. Now, I've always said, I think in the very beginning, when you're talking about this, the problem I have is the other crap that the evidence that was introduced, especially we talked at length about the foot marks, and like that's so bad that it to me it wipes out any of all, like there's almost no hope now. I can't look back on that at least that first conviction, and be like, man, was that a legitimate one? I can't say that it is, because it's not, and then that's not necessarily a statement of their innocence, just as to say they pulled so much crap that the water is so muddy that it's impossible to get a clear picture. And that kind of is what ended up, happening in the end, is what the Attorney General kind of said. basically admitted to. And I just, it's so unfortunate, because that's the real tragedy. I think when you have like police or, these kind of, whatever you want to call it, a mistake or over eagerness or whatever, however you want to describe it, the unfortunate result of that is that we don't get, a sense of fair play and a sense of justice from the outcome. And that's a tragedy.
Right. Yeah, because like you said, it is compelling. Would it be considered circumstantial or physical evidence because of his?
I would give it physical. I mean, here's a guy that's, a kid who's beaten and stomped to death, and then you have a guy coming in the very night saying, or, the next night, but saying this happened the night before with a foot injury. I mean, that's that's an A to B line you draw, that you can for anyone. As an attorney, I'd be salivating over that if I was trying, if I was a prosecutor. I'd be like, this is it. I mean, you'd have to make an extraordinary coincidence to have a guy get stomped to death and then another guy who hurt his foot so badly getting in a fight, kicking someone.
Right. And so he comes in and says he got in a fight. And like I was saying, or defending his stance that, I was just trying to sound macho. So he's not talking to a group of cheerleaders like, oh, I got in a fight. He's talking to a middle-aged nurse. Like, who cares?
Yeah, exactly.
But then...
That's so subjective, though, when you make an excuse like that, to me, I guess it doesn't matter. If I was on a jury and was trying to do my civic duty, I wouldn't use that so much as what do I have in front of me that's solid and certain that I know. And that's what's solid and certain that is here's a guy in a town the size of Fairbanks, that's an extraordinary coincidence. It may end up being bad luck, and I guess would come the difficulty there is if I was going off just that, is that enough to get rid of reasonable doubt? And, if I was applying that phrase, reasonable doubt, that term, I think there is a reasonable doubt there. I still would, I guess, lean towards that. But also, I mean, when you're, he was already being charged with an unrelated felony. I think the judge, had said to him, like, this has been an escalation, of this kind of stuff. And, his trouble in the law, that's all damning stuff. Here's a guy that's, he's accused of pulling gun on other people, and he just so happens to have a hurt foot the night of some poor kid gets stomped to death. Like, man, that's tough.
So he did have more than a few, I want to say 3 or 4 witnesses that saw him outside of a bar at 3 a.m. And he was, quote, horse playing, drunkenly roughhousing on the sidewalk outside of the bar. He got kicked out of the bar for being too drunk. But I'm wondering, I mean, for a 150-pound guy, he drank an absurd amount that night. He drank somewhere around 10 beers, Bacardi all night, more beers. So let's say, now that attack happened at 1:30. So if you have that much booze in your system, could you not be feeling it? It might set in later. Even if he injured himself sober, it could take a while for the pain to set in. Now, if I was his defense, I would say, well, he got a ride from that bar and he got out downtown and walked home that night. I don't know how far it was, but it was a bit of a walk. I'm going to estimate maybe a 15-minute walk. I'm just guessing, but
they're saying like 20 minutes is what I'm reading here.
So
20 or so. Yeah.
If
to the wedding, you mean?
No, from the bar after the wedding reception, they went to a bar. He gets a ride home from the bar, walks home from the car back to his house, and by that point it's like 4 a.m. So, I'm wondering if you had stomped someone, hurt your foot at 1:30 a.m., it's not like the driver wasn't willing to just drive him all the way home. So would you choose to walk? Or you just, but when you're that drunk, there's no rhyme or reason for any of your actions,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I guess the you know the and looking at this in the timeline too, even taking the foot injury, and I guess the reasonable doubt. I mean, that comes for you, I know, and a lot, this and going on the timeline on it because, I mean, Hartman, what they think he was, sustained his injuries at 1:30 in the morning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess what I'm reading here is between 1:20 and 1:30, George is with Volger and Vernon Roberts, Edgar Henney, and Patrick Henry. The 20-minute walk to the wedding, they stop at a friend's house, and this is when George says, he blacks out. So he's with other people.
Yep.
Do you know any of these other guys? Did anyone ever look at these other guys? Those guys? I hate to just throw out, but it seemed like they could even confirm that we were with him, right?
Yeah, I contacted them. They didn't. They were interviewed by police, and they said the same thing, but they were never. And I think it was just incompetence on his initial lawyer's part, but they were never called to testify. But then you get into that whole thing of the state was just saying, well, there's essentially all these guys are going to back each other up because they're all in the same kind of crew, and that's problematic. At the same time, so the way Prosecutor O'Brien characterized it, he's basically saying all natives are going to stick up for other natives. I don't think that's true, but obviously, but just in the vague sense of that, I'm not going to go out of my way to incriminate someone I know for. Well, it would depend on the crime. If they'd stomp someone to death, I certainly would, but.
Right.
I understand that mentality. I mean, that is kind of a Fairbanks thing. It's a hood thing, but Fairbanks has some hood culture going on, right?
Yeah. Well, any small town does. I think that kind of stick together, close ranks kind of a mentality is certainly, even on horrific stuff. I am agreeing with you. There's lines that I've drawn in my life, hey, I'll help somebody out, especially if it's it was a charge I wouldn't agree with. I think that a drug charge or something, because being a libertarian that I am. But I would even like to think that even when I was a kid back, as young as then, I would have drawn the line that hey, if I've seen this dude stomp a kid to death, pretty sure I would turn in any of my friends that I've ever known. If I was there, I would, I'm 99.9% certain that I would have stopped it, but
I would too. But I also have I've known different kinds of people throughout my life. If someone said to me, did you hear Tyler Broker stomped a guy to death? I'd be like, no, that's just not right. And there's other people where I'd be like, yeah, I can see that happening.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I agree.
I don't know what, I don't know what kind of guy George was. I mean, obviously he had been charged with some violent type of stuff, and Kevin Peace that night had come home drunk to his mom's house, and he was accused of punching his mom. I don't think he did. I don't think he did that, but he did rough up the house.
Yeah.
So and before that, he'd been convicted of, let's see, he got a stop sign ticket, and he was arrested, and he tried to kick his way out of the cop car, and, he destroyed some property. He's a bit, bigger guy. And, and also since his release, he, had a domestic violence issue. So, I mean, these might be, I'm not saying they're violent guys all the time, but it seems like they both may have the capacity for violence.
Well, there's a lot of that, in Fairbanks. I mean, I remember being shocked at, the first time when I left high school and went, down to the States and went to massive college parties, and there wasn't fights all the time. Everyone was just kind of hanging out, and I was like, oh, this is awesome. It's not some ridiculous it's that was and that was kind of one of the few, culturally shocking kind of things that I remember. I was like, wow, like Fairbanks really is a violent place.
Yeah, I was talking to Rick Allen, one of the attorneys from the post-conviction hearing, and he's from Fairbanks, and we were talking about that, how he tells stories to his wife who's not from Fairbanks, and people are just horrified. And I just remember like routinely watching like really violent, bloody fights and just being not really caring, like it, it was so normal. And especially downtown, man. I mean, that's just the energy down there is dark sometimes. Those bars are depressing. There's people from out of town that are coming in just to get way too drunk, and it's what it's known for down there. That's what it's known for, right?
Yeah. Well, I also think that there was incentive too, and this would always kind of angered me growing up. Is that I felt like I had multiple girls tell me, I hate it that my boyfriend so-and-so gets in a fight, but it also really turns me on. And I remember, multiple times guys getting into fights and their exes, who they'd known, whatever, would immediately latch onto them. And they'd just be hugging them and, hanging on, and then they go home with them every time. And I was like, if you just reward people for doing this behavior, it's not the same. I mean, look, girls were young and dumb, just as young and dumb as the guys were. I'm just saying there was also like an incentive and a reinforcement there, and it was just, I mean, it was astounding. It was kind of like, like Game of Thrones, like the Dothraki wedding. Like, oh, it's not, of course no one was getting killed, but it was like if there wasn't like a dozen knockdown, drag out, like bloody fights, in a party, like in a kegger you go to, it was kind of like, oh, it's a quiet night. It was just, it's nuts to think about now, and especially, how many other like big, huge college parties that I went to. It was so rare to see like a fight. It was a huge deal. Like everyone would talk about it for like weeks. If there was a fight. And whereas, in Fairbanks, it was normal. It was just so routine and just not. I agree that I know multiple times where I didn't even like pay attention. I was just like, oh. Yeah, that's happening. Like, I don't know those guys. I don't care.
I think it's because I think there's a lot of reasons. I think people from Fairbanks have kind of a chip on their shoulder about, just there's so many different backgrounds and in terms of Kevin, his dad, when he was arrested for, when he had freaked out in the cop car and tried to kick the doors out, his dad was like randomly murdered the year before. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. Jeez.
Yeah, he was at a boarding house down off like College Road by the bakery restaurant. I don't know if that's still there.
Oh wait, yeah, I did read about this. Yeah, it was a triple homicide, wasn't it? Wasn't it like some crazy?
Yeah, it was like some Bible salesman type guy.
Yeah.
And he just shot Kevin's dad because his explanation was the TV was too loud.
Roommates or whatever, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy stuff. So all these guys had, and maybe that's something else you can address is, these guys went to the alternative high school, which had a reputation. It was an alternative high school. It was for kids that got kicked out or couldn't make it in the regular high schools. And they weren't privileged kids at all. None of them were.
Right.
They were, and so, the only one that hired an attorney was Marvin, because he had strong roots in Tanana, and they raised the money for him. But obviously these guys weren't. There's an incident in Fairbanks where some of the Catholic school guys, I guess to explain to people that didn't grow up in Fairbanks, that there's a Catholic high school, and that's where like the rich kids go for the most part, and they're not even that rich, but it's like their dad's an optometrist type of rich, and it's not even a good school really.
No, it's not.
It's just smaller and probably a little bit less violence, but anyway, they got real drunk and stole thousands of dollars worth of alcohol from a shed. And that was like a famous thing that happened in Fairbanks, A, because it's a small town, there's nothing to talk about, and B, because they were all kind of more or less star athletes. And these white kids got nothing. They got nothing.
Right.
And that was grand theft. So
thousands, like you said, that I remember that. Yeah, they stole bottles of liquor, right? They swam across the Chena. Oh, I remember that. Yeah, jeez.
So, well, let's go back to, because I didn't have the same feeling on the whole, on the wording of the whole saga of them getting released was, so the judge said, we're going to release you because if we tried you again, we probably couldn't win. But I'm kind of paraphrasing. We're not saying you're innocent, and he explicitly stated that. And so then he said that the convictions would be vacated.
Yeah.
But
so
not.
It was a stipulation. It was a stipulation. There were stipulations made in an agreement between the petitioners, which were the Fairbanks Four, and the the prosecutors, which is in Alaska. Prosecutors aren't they're not like municipal run. They're run by the state attorney general's office, right? So there was stipulations in agreement between the Fairbanks Four and the attorney general's office, and part of that was okay. The petitioners, the Fairbanks Four, had to agree. They had to state, like, yes, we understand that, there was 3 jury verdicts. They were convicted 3 times properly and validly entered on proof beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning that they're not contesting, basically, that the convictions were valid convictions, right? So this then removes, basically, what in practical terms what this does, it says we're admitting that we don't have a claim for prosecutorial misconduct. We can't sue the prosecutors for doing something wrong, basically. However, on the other end, the flip side of that coin, the attorney general's office is admitting, hey, there is, based on new evidence and material facts, whatever, there is enough here to order a new trial, which would have been the 4th trial, right? But, and I saw, this was in a press release from the attorney general. I don't know if this was in court, but the attorney general said, we think it would be very difficult to get them convicted, which is essentially saying, we don't think we'll get this 4th one. And so there's a give and take there, but that's not an exoneration. And it's not even, I guess, end of the day, it's not an exoneration. There's a big difference. It's not saying these guys are innocent. It's just saying, hey, there was some stuff that's messed up. They deserve a new trial, but we don't think we can convict them.
I guess that puts them in kind of a no man's land, right? I mean, I have a hard time, maybe you can correct me on this, but what the state says and what they think are always going to be 2 different things. So if they really thought they brutally murdered this guy, would they let them out?
Well, I think it's, my experience with prosecutors, they pretty much, if it comes on their plate, they think you're guilty. And, if you're in front of them, they're assuming you're guilty. We put it that way. But I think it was more or less, granted, you could call it hey, they're waving the white flag because 4 trials, spanning 18 years, at that point, like that's that's a long time, and I mean, I guess it to me it was just merely a reflection of the reality of the situation. I don't know how. Granted, if you they toss those they suppress those their confessions. They toss their confessions in the beginning, and that that tread mark pattern evidence and everything else. Like, it's so muddy that I don't see how anyone could look at it and say, like, oh, these guys are innocent, or all the guys. I think some more than others you could say are more likely innocent than guilty. But I think anyone who says they know definitively on this, I would say they're a liar, or they're kidding themselves, because it's so muddy. And I really think that the Attorney General is just expressing that kind of, that reality of it. It's just too difficult. And the likelihood that they would get a conviction the fourth time, I think, was pretty minimal, even though they had it 3 other times. It's just a different world nowadays. Even if you look at it like 15 years ago, the trust for the police, and like prosecutors was greater than it is now today. I think, with the introduction of video body cam stuff and cell phone evidence, I think it's kind of, right or wrong. I think reasonable people can disagree the prevalence that, police or prosecutors railroad people. But I don't think that reasonable people can disagree that when it does occur, there's almost no consequences for it. Like it's next to nothing, like nothing happens really. And that has led to a lot of mistrust. And you see it in poll after poll. Like, people's faith in the justice system is approaching all-time lows, if it's not lows already. And, there's good reason for that. And it's also, I think, not really reflective of the reality. I think as bad as, we see examples of cops, like, I think for the most part, just like human beings in general, I think for the most part, human beings in general are good people. And that applies to cops. It's just when you make it impossible to punish the bad actors in any organization, I don't care what it is, people's trust in that organization is going to fall, because it's just, I mean, what do you expect at that point? And I certainly think, if the Attorney General was looking at it from that perspective, I don't know. But if it were me, that's how I would look at trying these guys again in this climate. Boy, that'd be rough. It'd be a little rougher.
Yeah, and there is with the current state of things, there's a huge racial component if it's not entirely based on race and discrimination. And I don't know if you've encountered this, but I have a lot of Native friends from back home. I know you do, and I've talked to some of them that follow the case, and I have a hard time even saying what we've been saying, which is, I don't know. It's possible George could have done it. I almost feel, I feel the pushback, because, and I'm not saying all Native people, obviously, but a lot of them that follow this case and are activists and know for a fact in their minds that these guys didn't do it. I don't know if you've ever had to kind of square being respectful in politics with, expressing, I don't think it's wrong to express some doubt, but I also want to be respectful. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. It's a fine line to walk. I just don't, I don't know, what I would, any pushback I got, I'd be like, I don't think 3 juries, you're going to say 36 people, the likelihood that all of them were just bigoted against Native Alaskans, I don't know. And I put a lot more faith in the American jury than I feel a lot of others do. I really do feel, often, but it is more difficult in criminal cases, because oftentimes the deck is so stacked against you, and people put in so much more, faith into a prosecutor, for example, and just kind of going with whatever they kind of state. There is a lot of that. because people, I mean, especially, maybe not so much in our generation, but in the previous generation, certainly. I mean, I have talked to attorneys that, many of them clerked, for judges and stuff, and they would sometimes hear, juries in the next room or something. And maybe often some of them would say things like, well, the cops had to have a reason to arrest this guy. This doesn't make sense, but they had to have a reason, right? And it's things like that, there's a lot of deference given there. But at the same time, I don't think people are dumb for the most part, and I don't think most Alaskans are bigoted towards Native Alaskans. They may have, perceptions, but I don't think they're overtly hostile, I guess is what I'm saying. And in as much as you can point to tragedies and grievances in the way that this case was conducted, at the same time, you can certainly point to evidence that indicates guilt to certain, to a few of these guys. And that injury to that foot, I'd point to as the biggest one. Like you can say that you could chalk that off to a remarkable coincidence if you want, but it's damning evidence. If you're an objective person and you look at it, that's damning evidence. Now, again, whether that goes in enough, you can pick the person solely off of that. I don't know. That's a much tougher question. I'm just saying to deny that there's no evidence, that there's no plausibility that one or multiple of these guys may have done it, that's just wrong. It would just be wrong to say, and it's never wrong to state the truth of the matter, or state, to I guess try to paint an accurate portrayal as much as you can.
Yeah, it's such bizarre circumstances. You have two of these four guys claiming, and I believe telling the truth, that they were blackout drunk. They were not there. They were walking around not knowing what they were doing, not remembering. I wonder how many times in modern history there's even been like a murder trial and the defendant was like, yeah, I just don't remember, like it brings to mind like some kind of sensationalized thing where someone as a defense claims that they suddenly have amnesia or something, right? And that wouldn't fly. I wouldn't think. I would imagine that the person would be.
Well, you could point to a lot of DUI cases and where that's resulted in homicides where that's occurring, certainly. Mm-hmm. Where someone has said, they hit somebody in a car and they have no memory of it whatsoever. That certainly happened. And that's the other factor too, like two of these guys, they don't even know if they did it or not. And it's so, everything about this case is so subjective, and it just, I guess if you put me on that jury, I probably would have, acquitted, but not to say that an acquittal is not to say that this person's innocent. It's not. It's just like, hey, you're supposed to apply the rules here and the due process, and and the criminal standard is supposed to be, the strictest that we've got, beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, it has to be, you have to be sure, basically. And I don't know how anyone could look at this and be sure. I don't. But I also, I guess that you can't chalk up everything to these guys were railroaded at the same. Couple of them maybe still. Because who had the best alibi? It wasn't Freeze. It wasn't George.
I think Marvin Roberts is 100% innocent. I think the reason that he was charged was that they needed someone with a car to place these four guys inside of a car because, there was a group of people going around mugging people and beating people at night in a car. Marvin has so many alibi witnesses. He was essentially at the Eagles Hall at the wedding reception the whole night, and the odds that he left for 10 minutes, got his friends together, saw a guy, beat him to death, went back and danced. That's preposterous. But and so on one hand, I from a macro, from an aerial view, I want to say, okay, well, if one of them is innocent, that means all four of them are innocent. But you have to keep in mind, these were three separate trials. Marvin was charged along with Kevin Peace, and they were found guilty. So and that's why Marvin is the kind of rallying point here. But just because Marvin's innocent, I mean, let's be honest, that doesn't mean that the rest of them are. I mean, it doesn't look good for the case that they're guilty if you really look at the timelines and the transcripts and all these credible people who have gone on to be successful and upstanding citizens saying, I was dancing with them that night around that time. You know, it doesn't bode well for the guilt of the others, but it could be a completely unrelated incident. Just because they're known as the Fairbanks Four, you know, that they're not a unit. They weren't all doing the same thing that night.
Right. I would agree with that. And I think, the timeline for Marvin is, boy, that's tough. And I would have certainly acquitted for him. You know, I had a bit on it. I mean, that seems to be the most egregious one. I would agree with you. But yeah, that doesn't say anything about the other three. And it doesn't, you know, and there were three separate trials. And I mean, it's just, it's messy. It's gross. And it's really, I'd call it a tragedy. It is that, because we'll never know. And Hartman's family will never have the justice or the clarity or the closure that they deserve. And there's a lot of blame to go around for that. And, but in the end, it's weird in that the system the end result did reflect the reality of the situation, which is to say that, hey, this is so messed up that, we're just going to wave the white flag and call it quits on all this. And that, I don't know how, you could have, I don't know, to just declare to exonerate them, I think would have been the wrong result too. I do. Maybe Marvin, maybe that's different for him, but certainly, with the others, I think there's just not enough to toss out convictions on what I've seen, at least. Others may have, different perspectives on that, but
yeah, it is I think it's important to admit what a tragedy it is, in that everyone's a loser. You have this kid that was just brutally beaten to death, and you have this guy, William Holmes, writing a letter saying that him and 5 of his buddies had actually done the deed, and but he's already in prison for life as his buddy, who apparently, according to him, did all the stomping. He's never going to get out of prison. You have John Hartman's brother, Chris Kelly, who's, in his own words, just traumatized and damaged for life by this. He's convinced that the Fairbanks Four are guilty. And you could see why he may want to have some closure on it. Why, psychologically, he might be incentivized to believe that they're guilty. And another really sad thing, and I guess ironic thing about it is that, you have the supporters of the Fairbanks Four claiming racism was behind these convictions. And then you look at John Hartman's brother, who runs a Facebook page called, it's filled with racist diatribes against Native people and things that you just shouldn't say. And so it almost validates the people that are claiming that racism is a huge factor, because you see that it does exist. And growing up in Fairbanks, I never saw very much of it. I did hear comments. We all heard comments. Oh, look at that drunk Native downtown. They talk funny, stupid Native. Maybe, you would hear that from people you knew, not people I would call friends necessarily, but I didn't get a lot of. I didn't think there was a large extent to it. I'm also white. I'm like one of the whitest people on planet Earth. So, maybe I wasn't as privy to it. Maybe it wasn't something I would notice. But, it does when you see the things that are, I'll do a reading of some of the stuff later, but it does kind of show that sentiment, those sentiments are out there. And I don't know the racial makeup of the juries.
I don't either.
Juries are kept confidential. I know that 2 or 3 have been identified and they were white, but I don't know. Like you said, there's not a lot of people in Alaska that are going to say, oh, these guys are native, they probably murdered this guy, right? It doesn't ring true to me.
No, I think more likely if there was, the killing was so outrageous and so appalling. And, in those kind of situations, even, what you might call like normal folk get kind of ravenous and rage-filled and want to string people up kind of a thing, metaphorically, I guess.
That's actually psychologically proven that in times of danger, people do get more like xenophobic and bigoted.
Right. Yeah, I guess, and I could see, but one of the guys, he's not Native Alaskan, so I guess you'd always have that counter from others. I would see, I did as well. I had, same childhood as you did, same place. And I would see, those making fun of, you might see an intoxicated Native Alaskan downtown and laugh at it or something or make a comment. But I didn't really see a lot of prevalent, like, I had a lot of Native friends, like you did too. Like if a Native Alaskan would come into our group, no one would be like, hey, get out of here, Native, or something, some craziness like that. I guess, it was never, I don't know, but man, a Facebook page, and you tell me that, maybe I just didn't see it, and I'm as pretty far white as it gets as well, but, and so granted, I didn't have the same experiences as Native Alaskans who couldn't, but, I guess growing up, I don't know, I don't.
Well, this is a trailer park dwelling meth addict. I don't think he represents a whole lot of people either, but
right.
There's how many people voted for Trump? Let's put it that way. I don't know.
Yeah. And I wouldn't have said that there were that many. Just on my experience, I'd have been like, no way could he get 74 million people, to back those guys, especially after what we've seen in the last 4 years, the xenophobia, bigotry, and I worked for Republicans at one point, and I remember having a conversation with a guy who was a very intelligent, moderate guy. I would say he was not a MAGA dude, but he was a Republican, and there was a lot of it seemed to be support of Trump. It is this anti-establishment stuff, right? They're looking out at a world that doesn't really make sense to them, that doesn't really accept them in the same way that maybe they're used to. And he told me, he was like, but what is really, the media just overblows everything. What has Trump really done that's racist? And it was kind of like, he's not racist so much as that he'll just attack and exploit anyone who's up against him. He hasn't really done anything racist per se. Like, there's no evidence he's a racist. And my answer to that was, like, for God's sakes, like, if you don't think that, he made his bones off birtherism, and if you don't think making a huge national spectacle and saying that the first, president whose skin pigmentation was black, was not born in this country, and making and part of some secret plot, and doing all this without a scintilla of evidence, and in spite of all available evidence, which refutes it. If you don't think that that's racist, like, then I just don't think you have the capacity to see racism. Like, come on. That's racist, and it's not. And what was he? Is he attacking Obama for? Like, Obama wasn't going to run again. What was this about? He was, whether or not, and it almost becomes besides the point. Whether in his heart he's racist or not. If you'll do everything if you'll act racist to get the racist, I don't see what distinction you're making or why it should matter to me.
That's true. I've always made that distinction when talking to a Trump person that, yeah, I don't know if Trump is actually racist, but he says very racist things and does a lot of racist dog whistling. So if that's the hill you want to die on with that, congratulations.
I guess I do too. Like, I mean, you're saying, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest he's a racist. I mean, all Haitians have AIDS, stuff that he says in private. I mean, come on. That's what are we? What is this going on?
Well, yeah. At a certain point, like, what do you have to actually say to be a racist? I mean,
come on.
What?
A Mexican judge can't decide a case because he's. I mean, that is the definition of racism. And what it seems like projection to say, well, he was just attacking that judge because he ruled out. No, like he specifically chose that way to attack him. And to me, that's, there's lots of other things that you can say there. And to use that is what a racist would do. So to me, there's just overwhelming evidence, like the birtherism. And it starts with birtherism. Okay, yeah, you can, there's a whole lot of ways, legitimate ways, I feel easy ways that you could have attacked Obama. Like doing that, like that's a racist inclination. You do that because that's inherent in you, I think. That's what it seems to me. Other people could say whatever they want of you. It's all subjective. You're talking about another person's intent, and that always becomes difficult. But to me, the evidence is pretty freaking clear cut, and I won't have an engagement with somebody on that, like, legitimately. Like, that to me, you're coming from bad faith if you're not going to admit that. I mean, if Trump isn't racist, who the hell could we ever say is racist? You can't say anybody is, man.
Yeah.
Because you could just, anytime a white supremacist attack him, like, oh, well, he's just using race, to attack a black guy and call him that because really he's got, economic angst. And this is just his tool that, I mean, come on, you can make excuses for every race like that. It's just enough.
Yeah.
Call the guy what he is. He's given plenty of evidence.
Who's got the time for parsing things to that degree when the answer's right in front of your face? In fact, the only journalist I could find that is convinced 100% that these four guys are guilty is she runs a website called, and I looked on the merchandise page and she's just selling Trump stuff. So there you go. So we're going to get out of here. Do you think these guys should be able to sue civilly for their incarceration?
Look, it's not you don't want convictions being questioned and overturned. That's not good for now. If wrongful convictions, certainly you want innocent people to go free, and I'm all for a mechanism for that to happen. But you want, I think, anyone who wants a fair criminal justice system wants a verdict, a lawful verdict handed down by a jury to be binding, right? And I think in as much as that the Attorney General has admitted, hey, I think if this trial were done today, I don't think we can convict these guys, so we're just going to give up. That's the right outcome. I don't necessarily, I don't know. I don't. I guess, if you're asking me to put a gun in my head, I would say no, I don't think they should be able to sue. I don't. Unless, the law would have to change substantially. There'd have to be tougher, as far as rules of evidence go, especially on like pattern and trademark stuff like that. If we finally have, some where courts said, hey, this was all bogus, that I think bolsters your claim to sue. But as of right now, I can't go off what I think the law should be. I have to go off what I think the law is. And as far as, I don't know. I don't think I should overvise and say I don't think so. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, in reading about when they vacated it, to hear Hartman's brother, that's the other side of this. Like, I mean, think about it. If this was your brother, these guys who you're pretty convinced probably these guys did it, and you're seeing them go free and celebrated, by others. I mean, it's tough. It's tough. There's nothing easy about this, and there's nothing, I just think there's so much, it's just a double-edged sword when it gets this muddy. And that, I think, also goes in, with the civil case. Now, whether they should be able to bring a civil case is a different question, and whether I would decide for them in a civil case. I want to make that clear. There's a big difference between saying someone shouldn't have access to a court, as in saying I would grant their release, or I would side with them on what they want. And I think there is enough there to be kind of, boy, some things are kind of wrong here. But yeah, it's a tough all the way around. And boy.
Please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It takes about a minute. Really helps out. Please tell a friend. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder on Ice. I'm Matt Ralston, and I'll be around.